Hello there, everyone. This is the Week 10 lecture for App Mania, Apptastic, or Apperific. So the roadmap is that we're first going to review the reading from Apps for All Students, a teacher's desktop guide, which was included in your Blackboard 9. We're going to look at some app rubrics. We're going to talk about some app wheels. We're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with so many apps in so little time, and I'm going to explain the activity that will follow up the lecture. So first, let's talk a little bit about mobile devices and best practices. So in the reading from the Teacher's Desktop Guide to Applications, chapter number 2, which is the first portion, talks about mobile devices and students with disabilities. What do best practices tell us? And I'm sure you'll recognize the author. That was from Dr. Newton and her partner, Amy Dell, who also wrote her book with her. But it's interesting because she really brings to the forefront the SED framework and how we can kind of become disillusioned with such a great tool and so much opportunity for using in a wide variety of places, environments, because it's so portable and it is so affordable compared to other things that we can really be masked by the tool. And I put a link here from an article written by Don Johnston, the owner of the company, and it talks about iPads are the answer, but what was the question? And he once again emphasizes the SED framework, and I encourage you to go to that link and read that article because it's really interesting. And what I also did is I included this video that we're going to watch that really just talks about how we can pick the device over the task that it needs to be used for. And I think that this video perfectly exemplifies sometimes what happens with assistive technology is that we get caught up in the tools and we try and reinvent the wheel or make things that will be fine with just paper and pencil and make it a little bit more complicated. For example, if we're looking with a student who has a fine motor difficulty in math and they're younger, we will often try and use the computer or use an iPad when maybe just using a stamp set with the numbers 1 through 9 would be sufficient. And now you're not adding as many obstacles and creating a whole layer of barriers by bringing in the iPad because you have to transfer the work onto the iPad, you have to figure out how to print it, when stamping could be a perfect option. So I feel like one of the dangers with the iPad is that it's so easy to jump to that as a solution for a problem because the tool can be so accessible and is so widely known, and it can kind of mask thinking about the lower end of the continuum. So some of the keys for consideration when we're looking at the actual iPad, specifically is the device appropriate? And this pulls in least restrictive environment because if the school is a Google school or if there's one-to-one Chromebooks, you really want to make sure that moving to the iPad and having the student use a different platform, there's a clear rationale for it. And at times there definitely is. But you want to make sure, once again, you're not clouded by the tool or clouded by an app and making and adding on more barriers than problems that it would solve. The other thing that Dr. Newton and Amy Dell discuss is the outcome from the app use. So what is the app going to be doing for the student? Is it going to be reinforcing independent practice? Is it going to support teacher instruction? Is it going to be used for the student to compensate? So being able to identify the actual outcome of the app is one of the most important things, and so often it's not identified. It's kind of, the question is very ambiguous, like, isn't there an app for that? And you really want to think about, will this app be used independently by the student? Will it be paired with an adult? Is it during instruction, before instruction, after instruction? All of those details are really important to make sure you're picking an appropriate app. And then also thinking about what are the key features the student can benefit from? What's the accessibility? Is it switch accessible for a student with physical needs? Or is it just text-based so that the student can use the built-in text-to-speech features on the iPad in order to listen to it? Or does it have audio features built into it? That, in my perspective, is one of the biggest limitations, specifically for reading apps, is that either the audio support is not there and the app is not text-based, it's picture-based. So even the built-in accessibility features on the iPad don't provide the support that the student needs. And that's one of the biggest downfalls and biggest issues that I find. So next, we're going to move on to chapter 3. And I think that chapter 2 was a perfect warm-up to kind of talk about best practices. And it really just reiterated the SET framework and putting it into that iPad lens to make sure that we don't lose track. And Joy even talked about that when we listened to her webinar on the SET framework. And she really talked about how sometimes in the world we can be so caught up in new devices and caught up in the new technology that we lose sight of the SET framework. And that's what chapter 2 really does, is it kind of resets our perspective. And then Megan Wilson wrote chapter 3, and she is one of the Apple educators. She actually used to teach in Amity and was their assistive technology specialist, and then she moved on, and I think she works for Apple now, but I'm not entirely sure. But she's an amazing resource for all that is Apple. What she did here in chapter 3 is she provided some specific examples of apps for math apps, world languages, and it's great that these apps are listed. But this book was published in 2012, and one of the difficulties here with looking at app lists or app recommendations is that it changes so fast that it probably wasn't even valid by the time it was published, unfortunately, because maybe some companies went out of business, they stopped providing support for all of the Apple updates, and that's something that you need to consider when you're looking at making a purchase for a larger app or recommending an app for a student. Will it continually update with the different Apple updates, or is it just going to expire or stop? And for free apps, usually it's okay, but if you're going to spend some money, you want to make sure that the company behind it is going to stay relevant. So those are some of the time implications, thinking about addressing all of the updates that Apple does and keeping that app supported. It's also something to think about when you're searching for apps. I can't tell you how many times I'm frustrated by searching for apps. Like I was just searching for sequencing apps and finding some good support, and I found a lot of really good reviews that were outdated. And unfortunately, these apps that I thought would be perfect were either no longer supported in the App Store for iOS 9 or just weren't even available anymore. So because the technology is changing so much, it's really difficult to find some valid resources or some good strategies. So she also lists on page 13 the top 10 tips and tricks for finding good apps. And I really like some of her supports, especially in looking at the reviews and feedback on iTunes, avoiding being scammed. Checking that the app will run on your device is very important. Number 10 is great because she says don't hesitate to email the app developer, and I find that that can be extremely helpful. A lot of educational app developers are either former teachers or usually passionate about providing support to everyone who is using their app, so you'll get a lot of really good support. Winston Chen is the creator of Voice Dream, and he has been extremely receptive. And it's really nice to kind of make these connections with the app developers. I know Dr. Newton and Bo have worked a lot with the iPrompts creator for autism, and they work a lot with him. I don't remember his name. I think it's Rob. So you can develop those relationships, which can be really helpful. One thing that I would add on here is add in YouTube. What I find is that if I want to preview an app and explore things, I hate that there's no trial. I wish you'd be able to download an app for even 2 hours or even an hour just to explore it, because there are certain things that I'm looking for when I'm downloading an app. So what I tend to do is I will then Google the app on YouTube and see if I can find a video of someone using the app or someone reviewing the app. So here, what I've included for you is here's a review of an app called Model Me Going Places. And we're going to watch a little bit of this video, and I want you to think about what are the positives and negatives of this review as we're going through it, as you're watching it, and then I'm going to talk about them afterwards. It'll load anytime now. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of picture-in-picture with the person who's actually doing the video. I find it very distracting. So we don't have to watch this whole thing. You kind of get the drift. So he goes through and he previews all of the stories. Now, positives of this is that he does give you a little bit into each of the different scenarios on that home page. What I don't like about his review is that he's not talking about the actual settings that are included in the app. He's not really telling us a little bit about the eye in the corner. What I'm usually looking for is customization. Can I turn off that music that he highlighted? And clearly this is a little kid, teenager doing this review. But I want to know, can I turn off that music? Not a huge fan that it's not highlighting the words as it's reading it, but it's not, this app isn't particularly targeting fluency. This is more of a social story sort of an app. But if you can't preview it, it's really nice to be able to look at these things because now I know the quality of the voice. And that can be something that you don't get to see in the screenshots at the App Store, and it can be really beneficial. What I like is that it's very clean. Now, it seems like it might even be Switch accessible looking at the clean format and the clean layout. So that'd be something that I can go back in and investigate more. He is really just looking at the content in the presentation, and he doesn't really go into the actual settings. So that's something that I would have talked about and something that I would look at a little bit more. But overall, if I want to know about this app, this is a pretty good video for me to look at before I make the purchase. So moving on from that one, and I'm going to apologize now that the scan that I did started one page in on chapter 5. But that is talking about the app consideration checklist. And really what the goal of the app consideration checklist is that it provides an in-depth review of the app for further use. So if you're reviewing an app for some of your colleagues and trying to give them some support, that really can help you in evaluating an actual app. What I really like about it is that it breaks down the sensory aspects of the app, the characteristics, access, and accessibility. I think it's quite time consuming. I think it can be extremely helpful, but if you're filling this out for every single app that you're using, it can be a lot. And as we spoke about last time we met, as teachers, we're doing research constantly, and we're always trying things out, looking at an app, introducing it, doing that assessment, and then reevaluating and continuing on if it's working, or reassessing if it's not. And I think something like this can get us bogged down in the paperwork rather than looking at, is it really working for the student? So I think this is helpful in setting the frame. It's kind of like in your undergraduate when you had to write out your lesson plans and write out all of the teacher talk. That's not something that you're actually going to do in practice, but it helps ingrain some of those routines and strategies in you as you're moving through. And I feel like that's what this consideration checklist can help you do. So if you were to use this checklist maybe once or twice, it helps you really comb through apps with a fine-tooth comb and look at all of these different aspects. So I really like I said, when they break down in the auditory section, they have the visual section, and it really lets you analyze an app from a different perspective, which I think is really helpful. And these are all things that, as you go through this a couple of times, will just become second nature for you. And then as you see a student, you can say, oh, she is really going to benefit from having complexity levels that are adjustable and a variety of levels. And knowing that feature exists and then knowing to look for that feature for that student can be extremely helpful for you. So I do like the consideration checklist. However, I think the presentation of it can be overwhelming if you're looking at using something like this in daily practice. So once again, I found that because apps are so overwhelming and there are some very high quality apps and very low quality apps, there's lots of rubrics out there. I linked to 4 specific rubrics on Blackboard 9, and you can review those and see exactly if you like any of them. A lot of them are very detailed, and I'm just going to pull one up for you that we can look at together. So this one in particular is the I Evaluate app rubric. And for this one, so you can see here she's got various domains going on. Curriculum connection, types of skills practice, age and grade level, adjustable prompts, adjustable levels, prompts, ease of use, engagement, customization, alternative access, data collected, state curriculum, gender neutral, rating. And then it has some additional portions for strengths and weaknesses. I think this one kind of is similar to that consideration checklist that we just looked at and kind of puts it into a nice little rubric. What I don't like about the rubrics is they're not student specific. And when we're looking at assistive technology, that's something that we really want. And one of the things that I find to be extremely important is prefacing your rubrics to making sure that teams aren't only caught up in, did it get a good quality in the rubric in order for me to use it, and focusing more on the student's needs. I haven't found these rubrics to be particularly helpful because they can be so general at times. What I think is nice is to help teams to evaluate high quality apps in general for more educational technology. So when you're looking at your classroom evaluations, this is something that I think could really come into play there, where you could help teams evaluate apps and learning that skill of being a little bit more critical of apps because there are so many out there. So the part of your activity after this lecture is to link and look at some rubrics and recommend them for teachers. And one of the most important things is adding that qualifier and that explanation as to when rubrics are good and how to actually use them. Okay, so like I spoke about before, when we're looking at an app, sometimes especially with free apps, I have a lot of teachers who just download a whole bunch of free apps and either just leave them on their iPad. I don't know if you guys have done that, or just don't even look at them or try them every now and then. And what I try and encourage teachers to do is just like how you learned either in your intro class or in Bo or Eric's class, is to go through a checklist. So the first thing is to look at that customization. Anytime I try out an app, like if I'm at a conference and someone wants me to try something, there are 4 key components that I'm going to look for. I'm going to encourage you guys to develop your own 4, use mine, and kind of explore how do you quickly evaluate something to gain an understanding of it and think about the students that might benefit from it. So I'm looking for customization number 1. Can I turn on and off the music? What sort of feedback is it going to give to the student if they get the wrong answer, and can I change that? So can I change the feedback? Can I change the content, or is it just a very strict content that the app developer chooses, or can I create my own? What about the accessibility? Can the switch be used? Are the students going to be using direct selection? Can they handwrite in some of their answers? Can they use any sort of drawing on there? I'll always get an answer wrong just to see what kind of feedback do they give me. Is it a big X? Do they just say that it's wrong and move on to the next one? Do they eliminate choices to make sure I get the right answer? Do they even give me an explanation as to why it's wrong? There are benefits to all of these different feedback styles, but knowing the app and knowing the kind of feedback style is important when you're trying to find a good match for a student. I have some students that won't look at explanations or even acknowledge them, so it doesn't matter. I have students who, if they get the X and just move on, they'll just keep moving on. I have some other students who like the elimination of the wrong answer and will continue on and will actually learn from it. So knowing the type of feedback the app provides allows you to then better match it to a student's needs. And then the content, is it really teaching what it says? Ooh, I apologize for that typo. Because I've also found that a lot of the phonics apps, for example, I'm not a reading teacher at all, but I do know that when you think about letter sounds, you want to make sure that the sound that the app is teaching is correct and is in alignment with what the student is learning in class. For example, when you're having sounds like P, you've got some apps will give that and add on that extra sound at the end and not make it very crisp. And that's something to really pay attention for, is looking especially at some of those phonics apps, is how is the app presenting the sound, and is it similar to the way that the student is learning it? I also find this can be very challenging, especially for math apps. With the new Common Core, the math teaching practice and strategy is much different from when we learned math. Some of that typical long division and multi-digit multiplication, they're doing like boxes, they're doing lots of different strategies, and you want to make sure that the app that you're recommending is matching the content that the student is learning. So I want you to think about anything else that you would recommend for teachers. In your activity afterwards, you're going to give teachers some guidance for evaluating apps. So think about these 4 that I use. Would you add anything? Would you adjust? Would you take some away? And think about what guidance would you give for teachers when they're looking at evaluating apps. So what I've created and what I've started kind of using is an app feature chart. So I find that especially in evaluations, using an iPad and having iPad apps can be extremely overwhelming, especially if the team is looking for phonics apps. There can be 1,001 phonics apps. And I find having way too many recommendations can be very overwhelming. So what I've started to do is using more of a chart and a feature identification for teams to help them identify apps on their own that would meet the students' needs. So I think of the evaluation as identifying the features that the student needs in an app and then provide guidance for the team. So here you can see I'm going to write the outcome or the goal of the app, the material needing to be covered, the accessibility the student needs, characteristics that are beneficial of the app, and then an example. So here's my blank portion, and now let's look at one that was actually filled out. Empire is about to start again, so I did my student names that were themed. So we have Lucius Lyon here. So the outcome or goal of his app is to support direct instruction and data collection in the resource room with CVC, CVC, e-words, and sight words to support IEP goals and objectives. So the material that needs to be covered is very specific. Wilson reading and CVC word lists and sight words. Things that he needs. He needs auditory directions. His touch and drag is not always accurate and causes some frustration. So knowing that, I'm going to look for something that's going to provide some guidance if he does have to touch and drag. Some characteristics is that he's highly distracted by lots of screen movement. So if there's lots of visuals, if there's, fireworks going off, he's very distracted by that. He needs a clean layout, and the team would also like data collection and to customize word lists. Those are two very important aspects that are weed out a lot of the other apps. So knowing what you're looking for is very important. So then what I do is I provide an example of an app that meets all of this criteria. So here I have an app example of Board. Under additional notes, I talk a little more about it. So the free version allows for one student login and doesn't allow for long-term data collection. It just tracks the last session of the game. And then the Pro allows for multiple logins and more detailed data. So here's an example of one student. And now let's look at the other students that I've created. This student is Cookie. So Cookie needs independent sight word practice at home and during reading centers and regular education classroom to reinforce sight word goal and objective. So this is much different. This is an independent sight word practice. So we want this reinforcing some of the instruction that she's getting independently. So the material that needs to be covered is sight words grades 1 and 2, which is very general. The accessibility that she needs, auditory directions and visuals to support. Characteristics, she stays motivated with practice embedded in games. Lots of animation is beneficial. Loses interest and independence with bland templates. So I have lots of students who are on the other end of the spectrum from Lucius and loves that game embedded learning and will really be motivated and engaged by learning that's more embedded. So my example here is Sight Word Adventure. So in my additional notes, Sight Word Adventure doesn't allow for customization of sight words or even provide scope and sequence or data collection. However, it's very motivating for students and allows for independent practice. So you can see how my two examples of this app feature chart can really show you how outlining the material, the outcome of the app, the material that needs to be covered, the accessibility and the characteristics, and providing that example helps teams put the students' needs in context and then match apps a little bit easier from the App Store independently. So now what I want to show you is I have a video review of Sight Word Adventure just so that you can see these apps that I've outlined in these charts, kind of see them come to life if you're not familiar with them. My internet connection is a little slow, I apologize. Okay, so there's the trial of Sight Word Adventure. So you can see in the video that there was some data collection and it did provide some of the words that it does cover in that settings portion, but it's not as in depth as to the situations where the student had difficulty with the word blue or what areas, but it will give you the words covered in each level. So the next one we're going to look at is bits board. That's a huge component of Bitsboard, is having that option to download collections created by content developers, in addition to download other boards created by other teachers. It really expands the amount of content that's available on Bitsboard. So there was a review on Bitsboard. So, like I said, there's so many apps available in the App Store. Narrowing it down can be extremely overwhelming, which I feel like is one of the reasons why the app wheels can be so beneficial. And one of the things that I want to warn you about is that in the app wheels, they're often identified by characteristic. So, app wheel for autism and chunking that disability into an app wheel. And I think that's something that we need to be careful about because we're really putting the student first. Some of the app wheels that I particularly like have more function, like text to speech, and they're focused more on the task rather than the actual disability. And so it's something to think about when you're looking and exploring app wheels. So how to narrow it down? You can use an app feature chart, which I recommend. I think would be a better option, similar to the one that I showed you, rather than using some sort of an app wheel. You can almost create a chart for each particular student to help narrow that down. So looking toward your activity after this lecture, what I'm going to ask you to do is create an app feature guide page in your Google site. You're going to provide guidance to your teachers in identifying characteristics of apps beneficial for students. So think about those 4 guiding factors that I provided that I use. You can use those 4, you can develop your own, you can elaborate a little bit more. But give your teachers some guidance on how they can evaluate apps. What I would like you to do is provide links to at least 3 app evaluation rubrics with a sentence explaining what the rubric does and where it can be used. And finally, what I'd like you to do is what I haven't really touched on that is an emerging field and can be extremely beneficial is app search sites. So the App Store is super overwhelming and it's not very good at filtering and finding what you need. What I'd like you to do is, given the information that I've reviewed in this lecture and from your reading, go on and try and find some good search sites. There's quite a few available out there because they can give you some more specific search criteria and set more advanced features, and that can be really helpful. So what I'd like you to do is find 3, search for some, and provide them for your teachers. And add a 1-sentence explanation as to why you added that engine on your app feature guide. So that's it for our week 10 Apptastic lecture. Please feel free to email me or give me a call or a text message if you guys have any questions or concerns. And I hope you have a great week, and I'm looking forward to seeing your app feature guides.